Good afternoon. Thank you for sharing part of your afternoon with Florida Nonprofit Alliance for the 2016 Legislative Recap presented by FNA's lobbyist Lester Abberger and the President of the United Way, Ted Granger. Both of today's presenters have been working hard to represent the nonprofit sector in the legislature for you, Florida Nonprofit Alliance's members. A few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Number one, we recommend that you call in for the audio portion of the webinar. The call-in information appears in the upper left-hand corner of the slide you see on your screen. Note that your access code is individual to you and is in the email you previously received. If you have questions today, please send them to us via the Q&A box at the bottom right of the WebEx screen. At the end of the session, Lester and Ted will go ahead and answer as many as we have time for. And last but not least, we'd like to thank the Edith Bush Institute of Nonprofit Leadership and Philanthropy at the Kremer Graduate School of Business at Rollins College. They are graciously hosting the Florida Nonprofit Alliance 2016 Legislative Recap for us today. So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce today's speakers, Lester Abberger and Ted Granger. Lester Abberger is the Florida Nonprofit Alliance Legislative Advocate. He is chairman of the Leroy Collins Institute for Public Policy at FSU and Horizon Communities in Prisons, a national faith-based prison ministry. Long active in the not-for-profit sector, he is the past chairman of 1,000 Friends of Florida, the Florida Humanities Council, Health News Florida, the Seaside Institute, and Leadership Florida, among others. Ted Granger is president of the United Way of Florida. The United Way is the largest funder of human services in the state of Florida, focused on working with community partners to address the most important issues we face in the areas of education, income, and health. So without further ado, take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, Kate. This is Ted Granger. I'd like to welcome all of you here. Thank you for being on the phone and attending the webinar. I think it speaks volumes of your interest not only in our sector but also in the political arena. There's a great need for us to grow awareness within our sector of the importance that policy plays in our everyday work. There are few activities we undertake, business practices we employ, etc., that aren't in some form or fashion either dictated by or influenced by policy. And that's why the Florida Nonprofit Association was created, to actually be the voice for our sector in the public policy arena. Until the creation of the FNA, there really was no organization in Tallahassee working with legislators day in and day out throughout the legislative session and throughout the year to represent our interests. And as a result, there were a lot of things that happened to us that either could have been avoided or that we could have improved upon if we had had an active voice. So I'm thrilled to be a part of the Florida Nonprofit Alliance. I sit on the board, and we work very hard to make sure that we represent the sector and have good things happen. We're educating the legislators all the time about the fact that our 76,000 nonprofits in the state of Florida generate over $78 billion in revenue and have over $183 billion in assets that we control. According to the Bureau of Labor statistics, there were 466,000 employees of 501c organizations in the state 2 years ago. So we are a significant sector, and the FNA is here to make sure that legislators hear what we're about and understand the strength and the opportunities that we bring to the table. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Lester, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the legislature, and I will jump in at some points throughout his discussion. And Lester, thanks so much for being here with us.
Well, thank you, Ted, and I hope you will not hesitate to jump in. I have great respect for your work and the work that United Way of Florida does and has done over the years, and we are becoming a formidable team on behalf of the nonprofit sector.
Hear, hear.
Some of you may have seen a column by former legislator Paula Dockery shortly after the end of the 2016 legislative session, in which she said, "What a difference a year makes." Recall the acrimony with which the year of 2016 and the 2016 legislative session began. Editorials decrying our dysfunctional legislature. The House had walked out of the 2015 regular session because of their refusal to take up the legislation that would have enabled the state to access some $50 billion in federal funds to provide much-needed health care for some 800,000 under and uninsured Floridians. They came back in special session to adopt the budget. They had another special session on congressional reapportionment during which they could not reach agreement. Then a third special session on the state Senate reapportionment, again unable to reach agreement. In contrast, in 2016, we saw a much greater level of collaboration and cooperation between the legislative branches. The priority of the House Speaker was a very extensive and substantive piece of water policy legislation, which is critically important to Florida's environment and future. And the Senate President's priority, equally important, was to provide greater education and work opportunities for developmentally disabled children and adults. Both of those substantive, important pieces of legislation passed within the first 2 weeks of the session. As you all know, and as we've pointed out in our legislative reports, the budget is the only bill that the legislature is required to pass, and as Ted and I were preparing for this call, he reminded me that the budget this year was some 446 pages with more than 3,000 lines of appropriations. The governor, as is his constitutional duty, submitted to the legislature a $79.3 billion proposal that included more than $1 billion in tax cuts, $250 million in economic development incentive funds, and record per pupil public school spending. The important factor to recognize about the governor's tax cut proposal was many of those cuts were in what we call here recurring revenue, which means that had the cuts been enacted, it would have required a specific act by the legislature to reenact them. In other words, a tax increase, which has become an anathema to our legislature. There was also an unprecedented situation with respect to the budget in that the governor's office was projecting that there would be some $1.6 billion in excess revenues, that is, revenues available for the 2016-2017 fiscal year over what was available for the 2015-2016 fiscal year. The legislature's economists, which is usually the base for the budget, disagreed radically with that. They thought at first that there was going to be about $650 million in excess revenue. They later revised that down to some $300 million. So the legislature, as it is its prerogative, used their numbers as the base in the development of the budget. And the final budget came in at $82.3 billion. They did increase per pupil public school spending, but they did not provide the tax cuts that the governor requested, and they did not provide the $250 million in economic development incentive money. The $250 million, some depending on where you sit, refer to those as corporate subsidies and incentives to bring out-of-state corporations to Florida. And the legislative leadership, particularly in the House, called that corporate welfare and said if we're going to spend that kind of money, we need to spend it on people in Florida who are here. In terms of so the legislature passed the budget. The governor vetoed about $250 million in projects that were in those 3,000 lines of appropriations. But that was in pretty dramatic contrast to the $471 million that he vetoed the previous year. In terms of issues of import to the nonprofit sector, and Ted, I want you to weigh in here. One of the most important, in my view, was the expansion of eligibility under the state's Kid Care program to the children of legal immigrants. This has been something that's been an ongoing effort by United Way and many, many other healthcare providers and nonprofits. A program paid for with 95% federal dollars, provide health care to more than 17,000 children, and it's a great lesson, in my view, to the power of ideas in this process, but also the power of perseverance.
Yeah, absolutely, Lester. This is a huge bill for the 20,000 or so children of legally residing immigrants in the state of Florida. Actually, it's about 5 years ago, in 2009, I believe, the federal government allowed Kid Care programs around the country to provide immediate eligibility to these children, and most of the other states in the country had done that. We've been working to get that to happen here for the last 5 years, and we finally made it happen at no cost to the state, really, since almost all of it's being paid by the federal government. This has huge implications for our schools in particular, where when children are not healthy, they're sick, they're missing school, et cetera, it affects their success and the success of the schools. So we're very happy with that.
And Ted is modest in not taking credit for the good work that it took to pass that bill, but I don't have any problem applauding his persistence and efforts. Also, in the healthcare area, there was an appropriation of $10 million to a number of free clinics in Florida. This money was included in the 2015 budget, but was vetoed by the governor. So this year it was not vetoed, so there'll be $10 million for the people in the free clinics who are doing such fine work in taking care of the people who are slipping through the safety net. An interesting piece of legislation, House Bill 153, is called the Healthy Food Financing Initiative Program, which is an expansion of stores to increase access to fresh produce and other nutritional foods in underserved communities. And this is a pilot program funded at $500,000 this year, but all of us who work on these kind of issues are cautiously optimistic that it's going to be a success and can be funded at a more robust level as we move forward. And I thought also of particular interest to some in the nonprofit sector is the funding for what I would generically call the arts. Those of you involved with this well know that there were punitive cuts in the state's funding for the arts in both the 2014 and the 2015 fiscal year budgets. This year they were funded at a much, much more sound level, some $34.8 million in 4 categories: the cultural and museum grants, which go to individual organizations, cultural facilities, which is a matching fund for cultural facilities, art museums, concert halls, etc. The Cultural Endowment Fund, which again is a state match for money that is raised locally to create endowments which lead to a sounder business model for arts and cultural organizations, and then a promotional campaign called Culture Builds Florida. So we were pleased with the results on cultural funding. In terms of a couple of very specific pieces of legislation that pertain to the nonprofit sector, there were bills filed in both the House and the Senate that would have severely limited the salaries of the people, the CEOs of nonprofits, any nonprofit receiving any state funding. It put a limit on how much their employees could be paid, and it also said that overhead, which was loosely defined but included salaries, could not exceed 15% of the organization's budget. Fortunately, we were able to kill those bills. Ted and I, it seems like we kill it every year and it keeps coming back, but a couple of the legislators, particularly in the House, who seem to have a keen interest in this are term limited, and we're hopeful that this is a bad idea that we won't see again. We work very closely with the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services on legislation to expand their investigative tools, which entailed what we call here a public records exemption. The people in the Consumer Services Division felt that they were hampered in their ability to investigate nefarious nonprofits, particularly in multi-state investigations with the IRS, the Federal Trade Commission, and with other state consumer protection agencies because of Florida's sunshine laws. In order to pass an exemption to the public record laws in Florida, it requires a 2/3 vote. But as I said, we work closely with the department, and we were able to pass that bill, which the governor has signed. We are continuing to work with the department in a forum some of you are familiar with. We call it the Florida Charitable Advisory Partnership, which has representatives of the nonprofit sector along with the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, the Department of State, the Department of Revenue, and the Attorney General's office. And it provides a forum for us to raise with those state government agencies issues of concern, ideas on ways to work together, and that sort of thing. And the bill to enhance the tools of the department to investigate the bad guys was a direct outgrowth of discussions in the Florida Charitable Advisory Partnership. And finally, and Ted and I will cover a couple of other things, we are also, on the sector's behalf, engaged with the help of some of the leaders in the sector in working with the state's Chief Financial Officer's office on contracting issues and how some of the obstacles that nonprofits are facing, and we're preparing as we speak for a meeting with the Chief Financial Officer and his staff sometime within the next month or 6 weeks, and we will keep you apprised of our progress in that regard. Ted, I think you wanted to mention the Florida State Employees Campaign and the social bond.
The social bond. So I think something that's important to note as Lester, who is our point person for FNA and for all of us in Tallahassee, is to know kind of the breadth and depth of the issues that FNA is covering for you. On the one hand, you know, we're monitoring and keep our eye out on the health issues, on the arts issues, on the safety issues, et cetera, to make sure that they might not have broader implications cross-sector that we need to dive into and support or oppose. You know, Lester mentioned the nonprofit compensation would have affected every business in our industry, and that's one of the things that we're trying to help legislators and policymakers at all levels understand, is that when we say nonprofits, we mean businesses. We are businesses, we're employers, and they need to understand that, and that we need to operate like businesses, and they need to treat us with the same level of respect and dignity as for-profit businesses receive. The breadth of our support is evidenced, and our impact is evidenced not only in that compensation bill, but also the bill that Lester just mentioned with regard to the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Investigative Authority. That authority will allow them to get the bad guys out of our state and keep them from continuing to give us, in certain cases, bad, black eyes, and taking money out of our pockets because they're taking money and defrauding people in ways that obviously are not acceptable. So in addition to those two, there was another bill that we're very interested that has potential huge cross-sector implications, was a Pay for Success bill modeled on activities that have taken place in several other states that would set up a system whereby investors could invest in new programs. After several years, those programs provided through nonprofit providers would be determined to be successful or not successful based upon their outcomes. And if they're successful, the investors would be paid back all of the money they invested. In other words, the state could get a program that's proven and not have to pay for it. This might offer us an extraordinary opportunity to fund new programs in the state of Florida, identify and recruit investors at some pretty big dollar levels to try some things that have not been done before that we believe would be successful in the areas that we work as nonprofits. The Foundation for Florida's Future, which is Jeb Bush's think tank down in Miami, is actually the organization that has been pushing that for the last couple of years. It went nowhere last year, passed a committee or two this year, and it seems to be gaining some momentum. So we'll be keeping our eyes out on that here as we move forward. Lester, anything else on your end?
Campaign.
The State Employees Campaign, thank you. The State Employees Campaign has a long and glorious history, but it's a history that has been sullied over the last couple of years as we've had some issues that have really darkened the picture for it. We have over 1,300 charities across the state of Florida that participate in the Florida State Employees Charitable Campaign, and over 100,000 state employees who have an opportunity to contribute to those charities through the campaign. About 3 years ago, the state contracted with an out-of-state for-profit New Jersey company to run the campaign, and since then, for a variety of reasons, the campaign has dropped by a couple $1 million, and the administrative costs that are being taken by this New Jersey for-profit this last season was 70%. FNA and the United Way have met with the governor and the governor's office throughout the last year. We're currently in negotiations with some key senators to try to find resolution to that, because obviously, and heck, I've been telling people, state employees, don't give through the campaign. If they're stealing 70% of your money for admin, give directly to the charities of your choice. But hopefully we'll be able to get that back on the right footing here through the discussions that we're having with the Senate and with the governor's office, and hopefully sooner than later will turn that around so that reasonable admin costs will be taken. And again, state employees will have an opportunity to contribute to the well-being of their state and their community and other national enterprises also.
Yeah, the state employees have been, over the years, extraordinarily generous. And as Ted said, we're committed to working to reform what is clearly a broken approach with an outside vendor in this. But from a larger perspective, this, we felt, had the potential to reflect badly on a lot of the other charitable campaigns going on because of the negative publicity that it received. So we're at the table, as Ted said, with key legislators and with the representatives of the governor's office to try to find a solution to this so we can move forward in a constructive way. So I think with that, we're ready for your questions and comments.
Okay, Alice Stansberry wrote in, and she has a question. She says, does the investor project idea have a specific name, and what is the best way to track the progress of this issue?
Well, they're called social impact bonds is the correct name of it.
I thought you were talking. I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about investigative process. I was thinking about Department of Agriculture.
We were both leafing through our papers. Now, Alice, they're called social impact bonds. We thought it might be a little bit easier to sell if we called it pay for success, which it is. The legislation did not pass this year. Again, a classic example of, as we talked about in the case of the Kid Care, this is a process that rewards good ideas and it rewards persistence, but it also rewards patience. We feel relatively confident that the legislation will be filed again next year, and through the FNA will certainly keep you apprised of the bill numbers. You can look at the Foundation for Florida's Future website. There's extensive information there, and Ted and I would also be available for any specific questions that you have about that.
Yeah, and there's been examples of it around the country. Goldman Sachs invested some significant dollars into the pre-K program in Utah. They're generating some good numbers there. One of the problems with it, or one of the issues that I think causes some problems for it, is that when you look at the kinds of programs that these that pay for success models typically might look at, like whether pre-K, for instance, is successful in helping children be ready for school and what the long-term impacts of that are. It takes several years for those outcomes to be to really be determined accurately. So we're looking at oftentimes with these kinds of projects taking somewhere between 4 and 10 years, and obligating state dollars to pay for them at the end of that time, and that has caused some logistical problems. The Wall Street Journal has also done an article about some of these activities that have taken place in Massachusetts in the Northeast, and the actual model comes out of England, I believe, several years ago. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, we have another question, which is, has anyone proposed a good idea to fix the SSECC, or are new ideas being sought? Yes,
absolutely. There's a lot that has been proposed. I guess the short take is that 3 years ago, when the state contracted with a New Jersey firm, we went to an electronic campaign, which is good. We needed to move to that to upgrade and you know, move into the current times. However, they also removed from the equation kind of the boots on the ground function that allowed state employees to be engaged and understand about the opportunities that they have to give. What we've suggested to the policymakers is that we go back to those good campaign practices that will help state employees be better engaged, but also that we need to have obviously a reasonable fiscal agent administrative overhead. And reasonable is in the eyes of the beholder, but when the United Way was doing it statewide, our statewide average overhead was somewhere in the neighborhood of 12%, 14%. And there were a number of United Ways, like the United Way here in Tallahassee, where when you gave through that, they took no overhead out of it. So there was not a double dip, as some people suggest happens throughout the state. So those are two of the things. There's not a whole lot of need for statutory change. There are some provisions in statute that need to be changed, but I think one of the great things about the FNA is that while we are dedicating ourselves to you know, addressing statutory issues and working with the legislature, dealing with the administrative issues like the purchasing that Lester mentioned, like working with the Department of Agriculture in formulating and crafting ideas that can be implemented administratively and through statute is important for us to look at. And so a lot of the FSEC changes that we're looking at would be made in the administrative code as opposed to in statute, most likely.
Okay, next up is, can you tell us who the legislators are that lead the effort to cap nonprofit salaries? And would it be helpful for local folks to meet with these legislators?
The House sponsor and the one who had been the sort of the leader of this effort was Representative Van Zant from Palatka, and I believe that he's term limited. In other words, he's not eligible to run for another term. I can't recall the senator.
I thought it was Evers, but I'm not sure. I can't swear to it.
It would have been Senator Evers from the Pensacola area. But the House sponsor was much more enthusiastic about it than the Senate sponsor. And
indeed.
The Senate sponsor, at the end of the day, was helpful to us in making sure this bill was never heard in a committee in the Senate when we went in and explained to him the implications of what the legislation was for the sector.
Okay, are there any legislators leading the charge on options for more affordable housing in Florida, or tax breaks for developers or vouchers for low-income families, et cetera?
You know, that's a huge issue, and it's been a growing issue. You know, we're members of the Sadowski Coalition, and anyone who's interested in affordable housing really needs to Google that and become a member. We've been working for years to make sure that the legislature keeps the promises that it made 20 years ago to use the portion of dock stamps that goes into the affordable housing trust funds for their intended purposes. During the Great Recession that we got out of a couple of years ago, they swept all of those funds into general revenue and used them for other purposes. This year we actually had a pretty successful year, and most of the money was dedicated to affordable housing. What we're seeing up here now and what we're really focused, I think our focus is moving, not only maintaining on affordable housing, but the workforce housing issue is an incredibly important one, and one that's growing by leaps and bounds, unfortunately, around the state, where people who are working in one county can't afford to live there, and they have to live in a neighboring county where the living expenses aren't as great. that has huge implications for our workforce, for the communities that we live in, for the quality of life for all of us and for our workers. And we'll be talking with the Sadowski folks about making that a part of our push for affordable housing, but we're also talking about legislators about this, about other ways that we can help address this workforce housing issue, because it's becoming a huge issue around the state.
I agree with Ted, and we were pleased that this year the affordable housing program, as Ted said, the legislature kept their promise, and it was funded at appropriate levels. I sense in some of these questions, and I think it's admirable that you would like to know specific legislators that you can contact and talk to. At this juncture, however, because this is an election year, all of the House members will either be up for re-election or there will be open seats as a result of term limits, and most of the Senate will also have to run again. This makes it a little difficult for us to tell you who to contact right now, because until after the election in November, we won't know which members will be serving on which committees. For example, with respect to the housing finance issues that the questioner raised, until we know who the chair of the appropriations subcommittee that has jurisdiction over that program is, it's difficult to give you guidance as to which members you should contact. We know that Richard Corcoran from Pasco County will be the Speaker of the House, and we know that Joe Negron from Martin County will be the Senate President. But until after the November elections, when they know who's been elected and who hasn't, they'll make committee assignments usually in early November, and we will certainly apprise you of those as soon as we know about it, and then we can begin to focus on individual members on individual issues of concern to the sector, and we're happy to provide that guidance for you.
Okay, another question we have is, could you provide an explanation regarding Senate Bill 12?
Was that the mental health bill? I'm not sure. I believe that was the mental health one-stop shop bill, but let me check here for a sec.
Kate, do you have another question while we're researching?
Yep, I do.
We know these issues by issue, and we don't recall the specific bill numbers after we're finished dealing with it.
Not a problem. One of the other questions is more of a housekeeping question. It says some great numbers and statistics were shared that I wasn't able to write down. Will there be notes or a summary that is sent out? And if not, may I request a few of your resources?
Sure. I think I'm making the assumption that the questioner is referring to the statistics that Ted and I shared with respect to the size and economic impact of the nonprofit sector in Florida. And with Kate's, our moderator's able assistance, who's doing such a fine job with our newsletter, we'll make sure to get you those. But 76,000 nonprofit organizations in Florida, $78 billion in revenues, $183 billion in assets, and 466,000 employees.
All right, and then I believe that was our last question. Oh, here's one more that's payment.
We're looking for Senate Bill 12, but I would just emphasize, as I said a few minutes ago, we're in an election year now. and you will have, as leaders in the nonprofit sector, the opportunity to meet with legislators and candidates, and we hope that you will share with them what you're better able to do than anyone, the impact of the nonprofit sector in your communities and in terms of the people that your organizations are serving. Again, you can talk to them, I'm sure, with great eloquence, not only in terms of the indispensable services you're providing, but also, as we just discussed, in terms of the jobs, the economic impact, and certainly the impact on the quality of life in your community. So we would encourage you to be involved with that, and we'll look forward to keeping you informed on these other issues that have been raised during the call today.
Yeah, my apologies for taking some time to make sure I knew what I was talking about. That doesn't usually I just go ahead and start talking, but we track over 300 bills during the session, and as Lester said, bill numbers oftentimes get muddled up in our brains. House Bill 12 is indeed the mental health bill that I thought it was, but I wanted to make sure. I'm not an expert in that bill, but I can tell you that the United Way supported that bill because of a variety of reasons. But the biggest issue was it's a very comprehensive bill that deals with, it helps to create a coordinated system of care provided by a community or in a region for those suffering from mental illness or substance use disorder. The staff analysis said that it tried to create a no wrong door kind of a system for folks who are having issues to be able to access the system, which has been very problematic for them in the past. It provides a couple of other things. I encourage you, for those of you who want more information on either House Bill 12 or any other piece of legislation, the legislature's website is called Online Sunshine. And you can go into Online Sunshine, you can go onto the House side, you can go on the Senate side, you can look for bills, get the staff analyses. The staff analyses are the documents that House and Senate staff write up on each bill before it's heard by committee. And they usually go very in-depth into not only the history, but the effects that the bill will have when it's passed. You can also look and do some research on lobbyists, on the Constitution, on House and Senate rules, et cetera. That was House Bill 12, and it did pass, and it has been signed by the governor.
And I just, as a tip, as Ted said, these staff analysis that he, excuse me, referred to are very, very professionally done, and they're objective, and they do talk about fiscal impact on jobs, all sorts of things. So if you're interested in a specific piece of legislation, by going to the either the House or Senate website, then there's a place where you can click on bills, and it'll show you how to get to the PDFs and computer files that have the bill analysis.
And we actually
appreciate the chance to do this, and we'll look forward to doing it periodically in the future. And both Ted and I, as always, would appreciate any suggestions you have as to how we can make this more informative and of greater value to you going forward. Thank you for your time and attention.
We actually have one more question, if we can squeeze it in, and then we actually have a comment, too. I'll give you the comment first. It says, looking into the future, they'd like to request the Alliance track proposals before the CRC.
Great idea. The state's Constitutional Revision Commission, which meets once every 20 years, will begin the preliminary stages of its work in 2017. And this is a body that has the ability to take, adopt measures and put them on the ballot for approval by the voters. The members of the CRC, Constitutional Revision Commission, are appointed by the Senate President, the House Speaker, the Governor, the Chief Judge of the Supreme Court, and the Attorney General is a member. And I believe there's 38 commissioners in total. And your question is extremely perceptive and pertinent, because this is an opportunity to accomplish some great things for the state of Florida.
And then our last question is there any serious discussion on the minimum wage this past session, or is it expected in the future? Specifically, minimum wage for tip staff, which I think is still $2.13 and hasn't changed since 1991.
I think the simple answer is just no, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but the bottom line is that the leadership in the House and Senate are not inclined to consider that issue.
There'll be bills filed by members of the minority party, and I agree with Ted, it's unlikely they'll even get a hearing, given the present leadership and composition of the legislature. Of course, that could change in November.
All right, those are all the questions we have time for today, but we have a lot of people thanking you for all of your hard work and for the wonderful session. So we thank all of you for attending this afternoon and taking a little bit out of your time to look into these advocacy issues and what our legislature has been up to.
Thank you, Kate, for making this possible.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.